The story of Morgan Doughty Bostick begins long before the public ever learned her name, long before cameras turned the Murdaugh family into a national spectacle, and long before she found herself tied to one of the most haunting true crime sagas in American history. Hers was supposed to be an ordinary life in the quiet lowcountry of South Carolina, a place where the marsh grass sways like a lullaby, where rivers shine under the sunset, and where small-town routines feel safe, predictable. But nothing in Morgan's life would remain ordinary after she fell into the orbit of the Murdaugh dynasty, a world of wealth, privilege, and dangerous secrets. When she met Paul Murdaugh in 2015, she was just a teenager navigating high school hallways, thinking about weekend bonfires and college plans, unaware that a single relationship would open the door to years of emotional turmoil and a tragedy that would change her forever. To Morgan, Paul was not the son of a powerful legal family, not the heir to a century-old dynasty that held the Lowcountry in its grip. He was simply a boy with a charming grin, a carefree swagger, and a wild energy that pulled her in. At first, he treated her with the excitement and attention of young love, and Morgan, raised in a modest, grounded home, felt flattered that someone like Paul even noticed her. And so began a romance that would slowly twist from sweet to suffocating. In those early months, they were inseparable. Paul showered her with affection, laughed with her about school drama, and took her on rides through the country roads he knew like the back of his hand. But even then, Morgan sensed an undercurrent in Paul that she didn't yet know how to name. He drank, often, heavily, and recklessly. Alcohol wasn't a social accessory for him. It was a crutch, a habit so embedded in his personality that Morgan could see the shift the moment he started to get drunk. His expressions hardened, his voice sharpened, his mood swung like a pendulum. He became, as many later described him, Timmy, a nickname used by friends to describe the darker, meaner version of Paul that emerged when he'd been drinking too much. Morgan brushed it off at first. Teenagers make mistakes. Young relationships are messy. She believed he would grow out of it, that his drinking was just a phase. Besides, Paul could be so loving when he was sober, generous, protective, and intensely attached to her. But gradually, the moments of affection became overshadowed by moments of anger. He would lash out unexpectedly, then apologize with tears in his eyes. Morgan forgave him, again and again, because she wanted to believe in the version of Paul she fell for, not the one who frightened her. Over time, those darker moments stopped being occasional. They became patterns. Paul drank to excess at parties, at family gatherings, on ordinary evenings. The Murdaugh lifestyle made it easy. Rules were suggestions, consequences rarely applied. It was no secret that his family quietly swept up his missteps, protecting him the way they had protected generations of Murdaugh men before him. Morgan saw it. She felt it. She watched how adults hesitated to confront the Murdaughs, how law enforcement responded differently around them, how Paul carried himself with the reckless confidence of someone who never truly feared repercussions. And yet she stayed. She was young, in love, and afraid to admit that the relationship was turning into something dangerous. She didn't want to disappoint Paul, she didn't want to trigger his temper, and she didn't want to believe she was becoming trapped. And so their lives intertwined more deeply, until walking away felt nearly impossible. By the time 2019 arrived, the cracks in their relationship were wide enough for anyone to see, yet Morgan still hoped that things would improve. But the night of February 23, 2019, would become the moment everything finally shattered, the moment that tore through several lives at once and left wounds that would never heal. The night began like many others in their circle: plans, drinking, and a sense of invincibility that hung thick in the air. Paul insisted on driving his family's boat, despite being visibly intoxicated. His friends protested, begged him to stop, warned him not to steer, but Paul was stubborn, fueled by alcohol and an ego that could override reason. Morgan was there. So was Mallory Beach, their close friend whose kindness and light-hearted spirit made her the type of person people felt immediately comfortable around. Hours later, after arguments, fear, and Paul's erratic behavior, the boat collided with a piling near Paris Island. The crash was violent, sudden, and devastating. Mallory was thrown from the boat into the dark, freezing water. The world became chaos, screams, panic, injuries, disbelief. Rescue teams searched the river for days, and Morgan, traumatized and trembling, kept replaying the moments leading up to the crash, wishing she could rewrite the night. Mallory's body was found a week later. The grief rippled through their community, and the Beach family's heartbreak became a wound that the Lowcountry still remembers. For Morgan, the crash was not just a tragedy, it was a turning point. She had seen Paul at his worst that night. She had seen how deeply his drinking consumed him. She had seen how quickly his temper snapped even amid disaster. And she had seen how the Murdaugh name created a shield around him the moment authorities got involved. As she later revealed in the Netflix documentary Murdaugh Murders, a Southern scandal, Paul's behavior toward her had become both verbally and physically abusive. The signs had been there long before, but now she could no longer pretend the relationship was salvageable. The tragedy destroyed whatever remained between them. Though they continued communicating for a time, their relationship was fractured beyond repair. Morgan's trauma from the crash, the guilt of surviving, and the fear she associated with Paul became too heavy to ignore. By the time 2021 began, she and Paul were no longer together, although their histories remained intertwined. What Morgan could not have predicted was that only 2 years after the boat crash, everything she thought she knew about the Murdaughs, everything the public believed about the powerful family, would unravel in the most shocking way imaginable. On June 7, 2021, news spread through the Lowcountry like wildfire. Paul Murdaugh and his mother, Maggie, had been found murdered on the family's sprawling Moselle property. The details were harrowing: 2 different guns, a brutal attack, and no immediate arrests. Rumors swirled. Whispers of revenge, of connections to the boat crash lawsuit, of enemies the Murdaughs may have made over the years. The community was shaken, and Morgan felt a mixture of fear, confusion, and grief. She had tried to distance herself from Paul, tried to rebuild after the trauma he caused. But now he was dead, violently, senselessly, and publicly. In the months that followed, the truth behind the murders slowly surfaced, revealing a web of corruption, theft, and deceit that stretched far beyond anything Morgan had ever imagined. Eventually, the world learned what investigators believed had happened. Paul's own father, Alex Murdaugh, had murdered his wife and son. The reason, prosecutors argued, was to distract from his crumbling finances and growing exposure as a fraudster. The revelation stunned the nation. The once untouchable Murdaugh patriarch became the centerpiece of a trial watched by millions. For Morgan, watching the trial was surreal. She remembered the house where so many moments of her teenage years unfolded. She remembered holidays, dinners, gatherings, all overshadowed now by the haunting knowledge that the patriarch of that home had been capable of unthinkable violence. She remembered the moments of closeness she once felt toward the family, and how quickly they dissolved into fear and disillusionment. As cameras captured every courtroom moment, Morgan was thousands of miles emotionally removed from the girl she once was. The world now saw her not as a footnote to the Murdaugh saga, but as a survivor, one who lived through the emotional volatility of Paul's drinking, one who survived the boat crash, and one who had to watch the tragic downfall of someone she once cared deeply about. She remained relatively quiet for years, speaking publicly only when the Netflix docuseries asked her to share her experience. Her voice added a new layer to the story, one of domestic abuse, warning signs, and the complicated reality of loving someone trapped in his own darkness. In her interviews, Morgan didn't speak with hatred or vengeance. Instead, she spoke with the clarity of someone who had finally stepped out of the shadow of a toxic relationship and could see the truth with painful honesty. She described Paul's drinking, his temper, his volatility, the fear she felt, and the emotional scars she carried. She also spoke about the boat crash, the trauma, the guilt, the lawsuits, the settlement that acknowledged her suffering. And she spoke about healing, about rebuilding, about life after trauma. By 2024, she found something she once believed impossible: stability, hope, love. In October of that year, Morgan married Bostick, a man far removed from the chaos of her past. Their wedding was simple, intimate, and filled with a peace she had not felt in years. A year later, in 2025, the couple welcomed their daughter, Briar, into the world. Motherhood brought Morgan a sense of purpose she had long been searching for. She devoted herself to creating a life defined not by trauma, but by protection, love, and safety, everything she once lacked. Today, Morgan does not seek the spotlight. She does not capitalize on the tragedy or her past connection to Paul. Instead, she focuses on her family, on her daughter, on her quiet life in South Carolina. She has become a symbol of survival, not because she intended to, but because her resilience emerged despite every force working against her. She grew up in the shadow of a powerful family's downfall, but her life now belongs wholly to her. While the Murdaugh story continues to unfold in courtrooms, documentaries, and news cycles, Morgan's story has moved on. She is no longer the girl tied to Paul Murdaugh's name. She is a wife, a mother, and a survivor who reclaimed her identity after years of chaos. The world may remember her in connection to a tragedy, but she will remember herself for surviving it. Morgan's life after the murders of Paul and Maggie Murdaugh became a strange blend of silence and noise. The silence came from the abrupt disappearance of people who had once been constant in her life: the boy she had loved, the family she had spent years around, the world she had once been pulled into. The noise came from the media, the endless headlines, the public's obsession with the Murdaugh saga, and the constant resurfacing of names, events, and secrets that she wanted nothing more than to forget. Everywhere she turned, the story followed her. It didn't matter that she and Paul had ended things long before his death. It didn't matter that she had tried to rebuild, move forward, learn how to breathe again. The world wanted to dissect every part of the tragedy, and Morgan found herself a name repeatedly mentioned in a story she no longer belonged to. In the months after the murders, Morgan kept her world small. She leaned heavily on her parents, spending nights in long conversations, trying to make sense of the chaos unraveling around her. She followed updates from the investigation with a mix of fear, sadness, and disbelief. The boy she had once seen as reckless had become a victim in a crime so brutal that even her worst memories of him felt distant, overshadowed by the new horror. And the father she had once seen as stern, but composed, became the villain in a story too shocking to accept at first. There were nights when Morgan stared at the ceiling, replaying old memories of Moselle, the sprawling property where the Murdaughs once hosted gatherings, where dogs roamed freely, where laughter echoed through the old farmhouse, where she had walked the same paths now marked as crime scenes. The contradictions twisted her mind. She remembered Alex Murdaugh smiling politely, making small talk, carrying himself with the confidence of a man who had inherited a legacy. She remembered Maggie's warmth, her gentle voice and kindness. She remembered moments when she felt included, welcomed, even protected by the family that now appeared on screens as the center of a double homicide investigation. The past was suddenly unrecognizable. Even worse were the messages from strangers. Reporters emailed her. Podcasters reached out. Social media accounts dug through old photos, speculating about her connection to Paul, her role the night of the boat crash, her reactions to the trial. She ignored all of it. She had no desire to become another talking point in the whirlwind surrounding the Murdaugh name. But despite her attempts to stay hidden, one question haunted her: how could a father murder his own son? As the investigation deepened and evidence unfolded, Morgan felt as though someone was peeling back layers of a carefully constructed mask she had never realized existed. Financial crimes, stolen funds, hidden addictions, lies stacked upon lies. Every new revelation about Alex made the ground beneath her feel less stable. It became clear that the Murdaughs were not the family she once believed them to be. She began to understand that the chaos she'd witnessed in Paul, the recklessness, the entitlement, the emotional volatility, stemmed from a household where consequences didn't exist and where secrets were buried instead of confronted. While investigators pieced together the puzzle of the murders, Morgan tried to piece together the puzzle of herself. Trauma from the boat crash lingered like a shadow. Loud noises made her flinch, nighttime drives brought back panic, and being on the water was out of the question. She saw Mallory's face in moments she least expected, remembered the sound of her laughter, the warmth she brought into every room. Morgan carried survivor's guilt quietly, believing that if she had done something differently, if she had convinced Paul not to drive, if she had seen the danger sooner, maybe Mallory would still be alive. Counselors told her the guilt wasn't hers to hold, but logic never carries the same weight as memory. The lawsuit that followed the crash dragged on, reopening wounds she desperately wanted to close. Depositions forced her to revisit details she had spent years trying to forget. But eventually, in 2023, she reached a settlement, over $1 million, compensation that felt less like justice and more like acknowledgement of pain that no amount of money could erase. It helped her move, helped her rebuild, helped her create space between her past and her future, but it did not lighten the emotional burden. During this time, the Netflix documentary reached out to her. At first, she declined. She didn't want to speak publicly. She didn't want Paul's memory, good or bad, to become a weapon used by the media. She didn't want to relive the violence, the arguments, the drunken outbursts, the fear. But as the Murdaugh story exploded across national headlines, she realized something important. People needed to know the truth. Not just the truth about the murders, or the financial crimes, or the family legacy, but the truth about the environment that allowed the chaos to thrive. She wanted people to understand that abuse doesn't always look obvious from the outside. It can hide behind powerful names, charming personalities, and a community that chooses silence out of loyalty or fear. When she finally agreed to participate, she did so with a trembling voice but a steady purpose. Sitting in front of the camera, recounting her experiences, she felt exposed yet strangely liberated. She talked about Paul's drinking, his violent mood swings, the fear she often carried, and the emotional scars he left behind. She talked about the boat crash with painful clarity, the arguments, the way he grabbed the wheel, the seconds before impact, the horror afterward. She talked about trauma, survival, and the complicated mix of emotions she felt when she learned of Paul's death. The documentary shocked the world. Viewers expressed sympathy for her, outrage at the abuse, heartbreak for Mallory's family, and renewed anger toward the Murdaughs. Morgan read none of the comments. She appeared in the series to speak her truth, not to be applauded or pitied. Once filming ended, she stepped back from public attention, closing that chapter of her life as firmly as she could. For the first time in years, she felt something resembling freedom. Soon after the documentary's release, Morgan met someone who would become a steady presence in her life, a man named Doughty Bostick. Unlike Paul, he had no connection to power or legacy. He didn't drink to excess, didn't carry the weight of generations, didn't demand her silence. Their relationship was slow, careful, built on communication rather than intensity. Morgan felt safe, a feeling she hadn't realized she'd been missing until she had it again. Doughty understood her past without letting it define her. When she had nightmares, he held her. When she worried about being recognized from the documentaries, he reassured her. When she doubted her worth, he reminded her of her strength. Their love grew not from chaos, but from patience, a stark contrast to the whirlwind romance she had once mistaken for passion. As the criminal trial against Alex Murdaugh began in 2023, Morgan watched bits of it from home. She didn't want to be consumed by it, but it felt impossible not to look. She watched the moment prosecutors presented evidence against Alex, watched his face as the guilty verdict was read, watched the world react. She felt relief, sadness, and exhaustion all at once. Justice had come, but nothing about the story felt victorious. Too many lives had been destroyed, too many truths buried for too long. With Alex sentenced to life in prison, the saga began to quiet, at least in the public eye. For Morgan, it marked the end of a long, tangled chapter. In 2024, she and Batten married. Their wedding wasn't extravagant, it was intimate, filled with soft music, warm lights, and people who had supported Morgan through her darkest moments. When she walked down the aisle, she felt the weight of her past fading behind her. She wasn't the girl attached to Paul's name anymore. She wasn't the survivor defined by headlines or documentaries. She was a woman stepping into a new life, one she had chosen for herself. Then in 2025, she became a mother. Holding her newborn daughter, Briar, for the first time, Morgan felt a depth of love she hadn't known was possible. This tiny life represented everything she fought for: peace, safety, healing. She vowed to protect her daughter from the cycles she once endured, to raise her in a home free of fear, anger, or violence. Motherhood didn't erase her past, but it reframed it. Every struggle she had overcome became a lesson in strength she wanted to pass on. Even now, Morgan occasionally hears the echo of the Murdaugh story in the news. More charges against Alex, lawsuits, appeals, debates about the family's legacy. Each new headline reminds her of the life she left behind, but she no longer feels trapped by it. She watches the updates the way one watches storms passing over distant waters, aware, but no longer in danger of drowning. She keeps her world small and grounded. Her life revolves around her daughter's laughter, the quiet mornings with her husband, the peace of a home filled with safety instead of secrets. She rarely speaks publicly about Paul anymore. When she does, it is with a sense of closure. She doesn't glorify him, nor does she villainize him. She acknowledges the good moments, the painful truth, the trauma, and the sorrow. She acknowledges that he was a troubled young man raised in a deeply flawed environment. But she also understands that love cannot excuse harm. Morgan's journey from teenage love to survivor to mother reflects a strength few ever truly see. She endured a tragedy that shook the nation, carried scars from abuse that could have defined her, survived a crash that took a life, and walked away from a dynasty that devoured itself. The world views the Murdaugh story as a spectacle. Morgan lived it, and she survived it. In the quiet moments of her new life, when her daughter sleeps against her chest and the world outside feels still, Morgan sometimes thinks about the girl she used to be, the girl who fell in love with a boy who carried too many demons, the girl who ignored the warning signs, the girl who tried to save someone who didn't want to save himself. She doesn't blame that version of herself. She forgives her. She honors her. Because without that girl's courage, she wouldn't be the woman she is today. As she turns off the news, silences her phone, and steps outside to breathe the warm South Carolina air, Morgan knows one thing with absolute certainty. Her past will always be a part of her story, but it will never again control it. She has reclaimed her life, her voice, and her future. And that, more than any headline, verdict, or documentary, is the real ending to her chapter in the Murdaugh saga. Life has a strange way of circling back to the past when you least expect it, even when you've worked tirelessly to build a world where the old ghosts have no place. For Morgan, the years following her marriage and the birth of her daughter were filled with healing, growth, and a long-overdue sense of peace. But with a story as large as the Murdaugh saga, one that captivated America, inspired documentaries, and reshaped the landscape of criminal justice in South Carolina, there was no true escape. The echoes of the past still drifted through conversations, headlines, and streaming services. And every time the story resurfaced, Morgan had to navigate the delicate balance between acknowledging the past and protecting the life she'd built far from it. Still, her days looked nothing like the turbulent years tied to the Murdaugh name. Instead of fear and unpredictability, her world was now filled with the gentle rhythms of raising a child. Morning feedings, small smiles, tiny fingers wrapped around hers, moments that softened the scars she carried. Briar grew quickly, her presence anchoring Morgan to a future she once thought impossible. And Batten, steady and patient, became the partner she had always needed, the kind of man who didn't try to overshadow her past, but helped her walk through it when memories surfaced. Yet in the quiet moments, late at night, when the house was still, or during drives along familiar low-country roads, Morgan found herself reflecting on the path that had brought her here, not out of longing or regret, but out of the profound understanding of how far she had come. She had transformed from a girl overshadowed by someone else's darkness into a woman who reclaimed her identity piece by piece. Her strength didn't come from any single moment, but from surviving a series of storms that tested her resolve. Every once in a while, people still recognized her from the Netflix docuseries. At the grocery store, in a parking lot, at a cafe, someone would pause, tilt their head, and gently ask, "Are you?" Morgan always responded politely, though she never encouraged conversation. Most people simply expressed sympathy, admiration, or gratitude for her courage in speaking publicly. She appreciated the sentiment, but each reminder pulled at an emotional thread she preferred to keep tightly woven. Some encounters, however, were harder to shake. On one occasion, while visiting a small coastal market, a woman approached her with tears in her eyes, saying she had watched Morgan's story multiple times and kept thinking about how young she had been, how alone she must have felt. Morgan listened quietly, offering a polite smile, but inside she felt exposed, almost fragile. She knew the woman meant no harm, but the interaction left her with a heaviness she couldn't shake for days. She didn't want to be seen only as a survivor or an echo of the Murdaugh tragedy. She wanted to be seen as who she was now, a mother, a wife, a person who had moved forward. Meanwhile, the legal developments surrounding the Murdaugh family continued to unfold. New evidence, ongoing appeals, financial crimes still tied up in court. There was always another headline. Some journalists speculated about the long-term effects the case had on the surrounding communities. Others speculated about the future of the Beach family's civil suits, or about what might happen to the remnants of the Murdaugh estate. Whenever an update broke, Morgan felt a dull tug of discomfort. It wasn't that she cared about the legal details anymore. It was the reminder of how deeply intertwined she had once been in a world she now viewed from afar. There were moments when she worried that Briar, once she grew older, might someday stumble across the documentaries or news articles. She wondered how she would explain it, how she would tell her daughter about the girl she used to be, the dangerous relationship she had survived, the tragedy that changed her life. Morgan didn't dread the conversation, but she wanted to be prepared. She knew that one day, when Briar was old enough, she would tell her the truth, not the dramatized version the world consumed, but the intimate, human version of her own story. The version that wasn't about the Murdaughs, but about her. As Briar reached toddlerhood, Morgan found herself settling into a peaceful routine. They took walks together through quiet neighborhoods, played in parks filled with the sound of children's laughter, and spent evenings curled up on the couch as a family. The normalcy of her new life felt like a luxury, one she cherished deeply. She sometimes marveled at how calm her mind felt compared to the constant adrenaline of her teenage years. She no longer flinched when someone raised their voice. She no longer felt the need to monitor the emotions of someone unstable. She no longer felt responsible for another person's self-destruction. The psychological weight of her past slowly loosened its grip. Over time, Morgan found small ways to reclaim spaces and memories that had once been tainted by trauma. She returned to the water, a milestone she feared she might never reach. It happened gradually with Batten's encouragement. At first just walking along the shoreline, then sitting on a dock during sunset, then eventually riding on a small boat with her husband holding her hand the entire time. The fear didn't disappear overnight, but slowly, gently, it transformed into something manageable. She understood now that healing wasn't about forgetting, but about learning to live beside the memories without letting them control her. During quiet evenings, Morgan often reflected on what she wished she could tell her younger self. She wished she could whisper in the ear of the girl she had been, telling her that love should never make her feel afraid, that she didn't need to carry the blame for someone else's decisions, that she deserved stability and kindness, that the life she dreamed of was not only possible but waiting for her. Her past had shaped her, but it had not defined her. She had become an advocate for herself in a way she never expected. While she didn't speak publicly anymore, She occasionally reached out to privately support young women who sent her messages about surviving abusive relationships. Not as a public figure, not as a symbol, but as someone who understood the invisible wounds that linger even after leaving. She never shared her identity widely, never publicly posted about it, but responding quietly to someone who felt alone made her feel grounded, connected, and purposeful. Meanwhile, the Murdaugh story continued to be dissected by true crime communities. Podcasts debated timelines. Trials were analyzed on YouTube feeds. New docuseries were released by platforms eager to keep the conversation alive. But Morgan increasingly felt like a spectator rather than a participant. She no longer felt the emotional punches she once did when hearing the name Murdaugh. It had become a story belonging to the world now, not to her. Still, every so often she found herself thinking about Paul, not with longing, not with anger, but with a strange mixture of sorrow and understanding. She remembered the teenage boy he once was, the boy before the alcohol, before the chaos, before the pressure of a dynasty crushed him from the inside out. She wondered what kind of man he might have become if he had grown up different, without the entitlement, without the covering up, without the expectation of invincibility. She didn't excuse his behavior, but she recognized the complexity of who he was. People are rarely one thing. Paul was not one thing. In a way, part of her hoped that his story might serve as a warning, an example of how generational privilege without accountability can consume not only a person, but an entire family. She hoped that others might learn from it, that communities might see the damage caused when powerful names shield dangerous behavior. She hoped that someone out there heard her voice in the documentary and found the strength to leave their own harmful relationship. Years passed, the noise faded, the headlines slowed. The Murdaugh name, though permanently etched in the history of American true crime, became background noise to Morgan's day-to-day life. She focused on raising her daughter with empathy, teaching her patience, showing